So yes, as you've heard, I'm Rachel. I'm a UX designer at Google. I've been there for over 7 years now. I've worked on a few different teams, Chrome. I'm currently on the search team. I spent a little time working on Duo as well. And as you've heard, I'm going to speak today to the topic of design sprints and jams and make-a-thons and hackathons and all of those kinds of creative collaborative processes. But I want to start off with a quick question, which if you can type your quick thoughts into the comments, that would be great. So I'd like to know, why are you here today? What are you looking to get out of this presentation? Or, are you just interested to hear about design sprints? Or were you not expecting the speaker lineup? Like, what's interesting to you? And if I could hear back from the team, that would be awesome. Cool. So as those answers are coming in, yeah, I think a quick thing to add about the talk today is that there's a lens that obviously we need to keep in mind. I think, I've given this talk over the years about these different kinds of processes, and I think, in the early days when they were starting to be used and people were very curious about them, through to now when it's kind of a challenging time to hold something that's a collaborative, interactive experience. So yeah, as I go through, I'll be highlighting some tips for how to keep doing this kind of thing, which I think is really necessary, especially when we're working remotely, to try to collaborate in a really seamless way. So yeah. Great. Yeah, so that's a lot of good questions. I think from wanting to get our company to use design sprints, people aren't willing to invest, through to kind of cracking how to use design sprints for specific applications. And I'm sure more will keep coming up. So I'll try to address those through the talk, but I'm sure we can also touch on them in the questions a little bit more deeply. If there are any specific scenarios anyone wants to unpack, I always feel collaborative method therapy is a useful product of these sessions. So great. So I'm going to launch in. As I said, today I'll talk about, ultimately it'll be mostly about design sprints, but I'm going to digress very briefly to talk about where sprints come from, and maybe talk about, how it should feel to do a sprint. I think that's quite useful to talk about because for people who haven't done sprints, in the past, or maybe done one or two, it's not always clear, is this working? Is this how this is supposed to feel? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So yeah, what is a jam, a make-a-thon? What are the fun, approaches that we see, and why does that matter? So contextually, many of us are designers in the room. I'm sure there's also maybe product managers or engineers or marketing folks or other folks who I haven't mentioned by name, but ultimately, the creative process is just this thing, right? This is the, taking some time to understand the context of the problem that you're looking at, and think about whether that part of the problem is the problem you want to solve, and then to explore different solutions for it, prototype different solutions, to iterate and see, is this a good solution? Is it not? Which aspects of it work well, which don't? And then to try to develop that thing into something that can be brought into production and can be used by people. And of course, the important cycle back, because obviously the thing you launch isn't always the perfect solution. It's usually the first version of the thing, and you're going to build on it further. So I think the important note is this is consistent whether, whatever method you're using, whatever toolkit you use, this is really the high level approach. And I'm going to jump over to, where does this all come from? I think the root of this kind of collaborative methodology really comes from music. So these are some photos of my bandmates from when I was living in Germany, in our ukulele band. And I think that the takeaway here really is that a collaborative methodology, it's something where it's not the same as when you work on something by yourself, right? You're not a composer as you might be in your day-to-day job if you're creating mock-ups or a PRD or writing code, right? It's really a collaborative process, and it's designed for a number of different things, least of which is to bring together sort of the best knowledge of everyone in the room to come to information parity. And that's what that feels like, right? When you're playing a song and you're all kind of seeing where everyone else is going to go, and you're kind of playing off of each other's ideas, that's really when a collaborative method like a sprint is working best. I'm going to touch also on game jams. So game jams are also a great example of a collaborative methodology. So for folks who don't know, there's an event. It's called Global Game Jam. It comes around once a year in February, or end of January, I should say, and it's a 72-hour event over a weekend when you show up, you make teams, and you make a computer game, maybe a board game in that time. And it's a similar type of thing, right? You show up, you have this sort of arbitrary set of constraints that appear, are maybe made up, and you ultimately you play. And I think that's again this example of really kind of taking what someone else brings to the table and building on it and making it your own and making it the groups and making it something shared. So these are some games that I've made at the Global Game Jam in the past. Dynafling's good. You can try it online. And I think I've seen a lot of these kinds of social events. Also, I founded the Design Jam, or one of many Design Jam events, designj.am in Munich, and we have it here in London as well when we're not on hiatus due to global pandemic. But again, like you see this kind of collaborative approach, and I think that's ultimately what companies like Google, companies like IDEO, Frog, and pretty much every company now that's making use of these collaborative methodologies is really trying to benefit from. And I think that's difficult in a lot of corporate environments because they're not really designed for that, right? They're designed to create clear ownership and reduce dependencies. And these kinds of, highly interdependent, highly flexible and playful events are really the antithesis of that. So I think it can be quite powerful to not just in terms of solving problems and coming up with great ideas, but it can also be quite powerful to a culture to make these kinds of events, make them a regular part of the day-to-day work. Okay, so this here begins the formal part of my talk. I'm going to speak a little bit to what design sprints look like at Google, and what the difference is between these kind of like playful experiential events is, and what it means to do, just do a design sprint in a work environment and actually get results from that kind of event that can be acted upon. And that's the goal, right? It's to actually get something out of this collaborative event so that you can build the credibility that your company is willing to invest in doing them more and more. Because if you end up creating this like very social experience, there's a benefit to that, a cultural benefit. But there, in parallel, also you need to show that impact, and I think it's very possible to do that. Okay, so flashing back to the beginning of the presentation, and then this again it's a very similar type of structure, right? You begin with understanding the problem. You want to look at the challenge, maybe the market review, the business opportunity, the user research that has been done, competitive overview, design goals. All of these things need to be inputs to the event, and I'll speak to that in a moment. And the other key piece here is really defining. So, what are the main flows of the product, and which piece of that are we focused on? Are we trying to design the whole thing again, or are we, do we see a problem area that we're trying to fix? So that's the first piece. The second piece is about diverging and deciding. So defining the challenges, brainstorming, opening up and looking at all of the possible opportunities. And then focusing down. So focusing on, what are the areas that we think are viable, feasible, desirable solutions, and how do we attack those? Prototyping is straightforward. It's clear, right? We want to build some realistic semblance of this thing so people can get a feel for what that experience is like. We want to use real copy. We want to use real content. We want to give people as realistic of a feeling as possible without actually building anything, right? I think it's really important to kind of Wizard of Oz the experience, right? Make it look and feel like a giant floating head if that's what your product is. But in reality, there's a man behind the curtain, and you've got to kind of bring that through. And then the last piece here is to validate. So I think this part, I say it in one word, it's incredibly complicated, right? Do you know if people can use this? Does it make sense? But also, do you know if people will use this? And I think will use this is one of the hardest problems, right? It's when we invest and build and launch this, will it work? And the best judgment we can make about that, which is usually a good guess. Okay, so I want to break down each of these pieces briefly. I think it's important to do that, but I think I'll glide over a little bit because I think I want to give more of an overview and then try to dig in a bit more in the questions. So if you see something you're interested in here and you need to know more, just ask, because I'd love to wax lyrical on that for you. But I think here, when we're trying to understand the problem, I think, starting with the challenge statement, and this is kind of it's a moment when, in planning your sprint, you need to think a lot about who's in the room, how big is the group. So if you think about, I often think about the difference between the design sprint as it was kind of originally designed for the Google Ventures team, or created for the Google Ventures team. Jared Knapp and Braden and Daniel and John, they were kind of looking inside of Google Ventures at the companies that Google Ventures was investing in, it still is invested in, and those small startups or moderately sized startups were facing problems, right? They may know that they need to bring their product to market, or they might know that this piece of the product's not working, or maybe our customer support is really suffering, right? There's a concrete problem, and that problem is very tangible and very painful for the leadership. So I think in a case like this, where the room is small, you kind of have the stakeholders in the room, and you can, you have a small group of people who are actively tasked with solving the problem. I think that's really what the Google Ventures method was designed for, and that's what it works well for. And it differs a little bit from the version of the Google Ventures guys' sprint methods and how that was translated into the company Google, right? Because Google is a very big company. It has the complexity of a big company. Nadia Dierkova was responsible for kind of commodifying that and making it work well for large groups of people, where the problem is partially to solve the problem, but the problem is also to evangelize the solution, to create alignment, to create information parity, and to really make it go smoothly when you have a room full of 20, smart, opinionated people who all want to have their say. So I think that question of like, who am I designing this sprint for, is really, really important, and you have to approach it as a designer. So anyway, coming back to understand, when you think about the challenge statement, if you've got a small room of people, you can, start the day with a session where you say, like, look, we're going to define the challenge statement. Here's the draft that I came up with when I, spoke to everyone about this session. Does this sit right with everyone? Let's discuss it. Let's unpack it. Let's cross things out and write new words in. I think when it comes to a big group, a lot of these pieces, the challenge statement, but also a lot of pieces within the design process, that needs to be, you've got to do the legwork ahead of time, right? You've got to go meet with all of the stakeholders, and you've got to talk to them about how they see the challenge statement. You've got to write it out, and then you've got to share it out, and you've got to vet it ahead of time. The work for some of these pieces, setting up the sprint when you've got a big group, it needs to happen in advance, and it needs to, really the sprint is more about kind of everyone seeing that they're aligned on those core pieces. And then because they see that, that means that they're able to diverge and explore. So coming back to understand, I think the challenge statement, as I've just said, these pieces, when I say business opportunity, technical opportunity, the competitive analysis, and the user research, a great way to do that. And again, if you have a smaller group, this works better, is to run interviews. So bring in your head of marketing, or bring in your head of customer support, bring in your technical lead, and just take 15 minutes to interview them about the problem that you're starting to tackle. And the thing that this does, and it's magic, is it have them spend 3 minutes explaining it, and then take 15 minutes to ask them, and let the group ask them questions. And that will bring your group up to information parity incredibly fast. It'll be, the moments when everyone starts to see, oh, they don't understand how our system is implemented, or they don't understand what kinds of problems our customers have when they call up. Like, that's when you start to easily create this information parity. But it also, again, shifts the culture. It makes people understand that everyone else in the room is an expert, and they have information to share. And that, again, opens people up and lets them start to have that psychological safety to be generative and to be exploratory. it won't happen all at once, but it will happen. Yeah, the tip here obviously is you can do this in person, or you can do this still during COVID with video calls. It works just as well. Obviously, you need to think about the logistics. If their connectivity is poor, you want to get them on a phone call instead. But you can make it work, and I think it can work well. I actually had a sprint today that I think worked well, so that's one example. So one thing to note, I think, as you're doing your remote sprints, especially with this kind of understand phase, it's great to use tools like having digital post-its. So if you want to write out notes that can be then mapped, we write out how might we. So when you listen to a presentation and you hear, like we hear that our customers are really confused by the big button, how might we make the big button more clear? And that's what we might write on the sticky note, and then you might put those all in a slide deck and group them into groups to start mapping, and again generating that information parity, seeing all of us had this kind of question, maybe this is an important question for us to answer. Okay, let's talk briefly about defining. I think this is quite a challenging one for people because you have to start to focus, right? So in this phase, you might map out your user journeys. You might do this just on a whiteboard with a marker, right? Just draw it out and let people see it. And ask people in the room, right? Does this look right to you? Is this the correct reflection of our map, or am I missing something? Do we all have a complete picture of this flow? And once that's defined, you can start to talk again as a small group, or maybe in advance if you're a large group, about what is our goal here? What is the success criteria? And these things can be done in a variety of ways. You might do them in a document. You might do them, in a sprint, I would just do it in person. I would say, like, let's talk about what our success criteria are for the sprint and for the product. And, we'd write it out on the whiteboard and we would discuss it. And maybe if it was a big group, I would write that into a deck and I would have people comment on it. We are using Figma a lot right now. I actually haven't used Miro as much. I think people are really keen on it. It sounds like there's a lot of interest there. I'm primarily using Figma. It works pretty well in terms of just like, grab like a sticker sheet of some symbols and signs, and most people can figure out how to use it. You might have to push if there's any part of your team that's not already using it or isn't that comfortable with sort of design tools, you might have to push a little. But get in touch with them directly. Ask them, have you got your license yet? Do you need any help? But once it's in there, and everyone can start using it. And for anyone who hasn't used it, it's like Google Docs for Sketch. So it's really like being able to kind of draw in the same space, write in the same space, comment in the same space. It works well. So Divergent, I think this is the phase of the sprint where you're really starting to explore solutions to all of these problems you've come to understand more deeply. This is a photo of a piece of paper folded a few times to create 8 different squares to do this crazy 8s activity, right? Where you have a minute for every square and you have to fill it in with a bunch of different ideas. And I think like this kind of thing can be really valuable for looking at different parts of your solution, especially the details. I think at a high level, though, I usually try to give it a bit more time rather than pushing people to go really quickly. I might give them 15 minutes for this and say, like, just fill in as many as you can. Because I think what I found is that, stress actually doesn't make people more creative. It makes them less thoughtful. And I think creating kind of a thoughtful environment and allowing people to diverge with tools like Crazy Eights, then like letting them, share what they've done with everyone else in the group. Everyone else can see what they've done. Then to go again, maybe do another Crazy Eight, do a solution sketch. The iterative piece of it's really important, and the sort of cross-pollination, looking at everyone else's stuff and seeing what they did. Oh, I like that. I'm going to steal that. Right? Like that kind of cross-pollination, that riffing is really valuable. When we're doing this in the new world, we tend to do sketching and then shooting. So we'll sketch it on paper and take a photo, put it in the deck, and then talk it through quickly. Another good way to do it is a lot of people are doing now is the like I have an iPad and I draw it on my iPad and I share my iPad to the screen. I think that works quite well for a lot of folks. If you've got an old Wacom tablet, now's the time to pull it out. But find a way to kind of make your ideas visible, make them drawn. if anyone has questions about how to get groups of people to draw, ask me about that later. Okay, so decision making. I think this is really, really painful. This is a really hard thing for groups of people to do, especially people who aren't, like groups of people that aren't used to doing it together, and doubly so for any group where the psychological safety is not as high as it should be. A couple of good things to do. So the first thing I think that, and this comes from the Google Ventures guys, sprint methods, just be clear about who the deciders are in the room. I think, a lot of groups, and especially when it comes to like Silicon Valley, there's this strong culture of flat hierarchies and, everyone has a say. And I think that's really, really valuable. But if you have a startup and you have a CEO who's going to make the decision, or you have a technical lead who's going to like be the person who has to live for the next 5 years with the stack we choose, and they're going to decide, like, it's just helpful to be open about that and be explicit. So if there are those kinds of people on your team, make it known at the beginning. Just say, look, so-and-so is going to be the designated decider for those moments when we need to make a big decision. Like, that's fine. I think if it's true, the group will be okay with it. And then just give them the final say in the right moments. So that might be a moment where, we've created a bunch of sketches of different, pieces of the flow. We need to pick and choose, 1 or 2 ideas. They're going to be combined into a single flow, and that will go into a testing session at the end of the sprint. That's the moment where, first you might do a group dot vote. So get everyone in the room to put their dots on the areas they're interested in. Then once everyone has looked over and talked about those dots, why did we put that there? What was interesting? I had questions, all of that kind of thing. And the deciders have listened to all of that. They've benefited from the expertise of their team. Then you can say, okay, great, everyone take a break and pull the deciders aside and say, okay, now we're making a decision. This is what we're going to do. Like, which ideas of these were the most interesting to you that we're going to test. And then you can pull those together and put them into that single flow. I think one thing to keep in mind, by the way, is that those moments are really the hardest moments in a sprint, and they need to be facilitated very skillfully. You need to make sure that you're getting good coverage over the different ideas. You need to make sure the flow is complete so it can, be correctly tested. Like that's a skill moment for the facilitator, and it helps to think about it in advance. Important COVID tip. Yeah, you can dot vote in slides. So that's a really useful thing to do. We've done it a few times lately. Just make a template with different colored dots and tell everyone you get 3 dots, and then they can put the dots in the pictures in the various slides. It works really, really well. It's a good way to run a crit when you want to do it remotely. Okay, almost last but not least, the prototype. So we need to build something based on those ideas. So creating mock-ups, and I personally, over the years, I've gravitated more strongly towards high fidelity mock-ups. I think there is still some value in testing at low fidelity, but it's rare. I think, we have fantastic tools these days that allow us to have these really high fidelity, really accurate prototypes, and we don't have to ask people to imagine, pretend the content's going to be in here, or we can be really specific. So I think there's still a place for low fidelity when you're genuinely not sure what it is that what direction do we want to go. We want to get some general feedback on this. We want a signal, but that's rare. I think it's much more common that you're iterating on an existing product, or you're solving for a specific area and you have some concrete ideas. Then I think it's great to just build something in Figma that you can put in front of users. This is a really challenging problem when you want to test remotely with something that's a little more complex. If anyone's dealing with that right now, ask me about that, because we can dig into that quite deeply, and I think it's a very, very interesting problem, but probably only interesting for those of you having to do it. Last but not least, validation. I think validation, it serves 2 important purposes. So first, the questions and those success criteria that you've thought about at the very beginning of the sprint, like, the reasons you're doing this, can we get customers to buy our product online? Can we make the big blue button make sense? Whatever your questions are, you need to see, did we solve it, right? Did we, do the thing we set out to do? in a way that is sufficient. And I think the best way to do that is to put that thing in front of people and run them through it, right? And I won't go deeply into how user testing works today, obviously, but I think the main thing to do is make sure that the team that has participated in the sprint obviously has access to attend the user testing. We might do that remotely. In more boring times, we might have just used a user testing facility, right? We have spaces in our office where you can put a person in front of a computer or put a person in front of a phone and say hey, can you try this out? And that can be video fed to your team so that they don't have to all be sitting there staring at that poor person. But now you can always use something like usertesting.com to try it out remotely. You can recruit and have people video call in. You can have them just audio call and screen share. There's a lot of options. And I think that allows you to give greater access to your team, which is really important, right? They can not only see what does it actually look like if your product succeeds or fails, but it also creates this culture of it's just an idea. We try it out. It's not too expensive, and we see if it works. And if it works, great. And if not, we throw it away because we don't pursue bad ideas. We iterate on them and we make them work. So yeah, that's basically that. The last point I want to make here is just to remember to celebrate with your team. So share the outcomes, share them with the stakeholders, document them tangibly, take lots of photos, take lots of screenshots if you're doing it remote. And House Party is a really good app if you want to socialize with the team afterwards, but not be in the same video call you've been in all day. So that's it. And remember the power of the follow-up email. So remember to send a summary to all the stakeholders saying, look, this is what we did. These are the outcomes we had. You can watch the user testing videos here. And our summary is, if we do X, it will be successful. Or if we do Y, that won't be successful. We need to try something different. And that way the stakeholders can actually see the value of their investment and be willing to invest again in the future. We're not going to try it out today because that's a lot of time. So obviously, this sprint book, it's one of my favorites, and I don't say that lightly. I think there's a lot of different approaches, but I really think that the guys were really thoughtful about all of the different methods. If you want to nerd out about it, I really do think they've thought about it, and I'm happy to chat more. Steve Krug, Rocket Surgery Made Easy. This is a perfect guide. If you need to do usability testing, you want to do it for your sprint, but you don't have user research resources on your team, you should, but the team will see the value of that soon. So in the meantime, this is a great resource. It's got a lot of checklists and things you can do to make it work yourself. And that's it. That's everything from me. Thanks for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.